November 14th, 1942, the waters off Guadalcanal. Midnight approaches. Two massive steel warships are about to collide in total darkness. One is guided by tradition, experience, and the naked eye. The other is guided by something the enemy cannot see, cannot hear, and does not understand. In 9 minutes, the age of battleship warfare will change forever. This is the story of the first radar-directed naval gun battle in history. The night USS Washington proved that technology, not tonnage, would decide the future of war at sea. The Pacific War, by late 1942, had become a brutal stalemate around a single island, Guadalcanal. For the United States, it was the first major offensive of the war. For Japan, it was an existential threat to their entire defensive perimeter. Guadalcanal and the road to Tokyo would open. Both sides knew it, and both sides were willing to bleed for it. The battle had been raging since August. American Marines clung to Henderson Field, a small airstrip on the island's northern coast. From that airstrip, American planes could strike Japanese shipping, disrupt reinforcement convoys, and challenge Japan's air superiority. The Japanese High Command understood the strategic calculus perfectly. Destroy Henderson Field, and Guadalcanal falls. Lose Henderson Field, and the Solomon Islands fall. Lose the Solomons, and the Empire's defensive ring collapses. So Japan threw everything at it. Troops, ships, planes, supplies. Night after night, Japanese warships raced down a narrow channel between the islands en route to the Americans. Grimly nicknamed the Slot, to bombard Henderson Field and deliver reinforcements under cover of darkness. The Americans called these runs the Tokyo Express. The Japanese called them rat runs. Whatever the name, they were terrifying. Fast destroyers and cruisers screaming through the night, shells raining down on the Marines, then vanishing before dawn. But the Americans were learning, slowly, painfully. They had been humiliated in earlier night battles. At Savo Island in August, a Japanese cruiser force had annihilated 4 Allied cruisers in 30 minutes. American sailors burned alive in the water. Ships exploded before they could even return fire. The U.S. Navy had been caught flat-footed, and the Japanese had proven themselves the undisputed masters of night surface combat. The problem was doctrine. The Japanese trained obsessively for night combat. Their optical equipment was superior. Their tactics were aggressive and well. Their torpedoes, the devastating long lands, were faster, longer ranged, and more powerful than anything the Americans had. And their philosophy was simple: close fast, hit hard, disappear. The Americans, by contrast, had spent decades preparing for a daylight gun duel at long range. They had the firepower, they had the armor, but at night none of that mattered if you couldn't see the enemy. By November 1942, the situation around Guadalcanal had reached a crisis point. Intelligence reports indicated the Japanese were preparing a massive operation, a full-scale naval bombardment followed by a major troop landing. If it succeeded, the Marines would be overrun. Henderson Field would fall. The entire Guadalcanal campaigns, 6 months of blood and sacrifice, would collapse. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific, knew what was coming. He had limited forces. Most of his carriers were gone, sunk, or damaged in earlier battles. He had cruisers, destroyers, and exactly 2 operational battleships, USS Washington and USS South Dakota. They would have to be enough. On November 12th, the first wave hit. A Japanese cruiser and destroyer force entered Ironbottom Sound, the name already darkly appropriate, and clashed with American cruisers and destroyers in a chaotic, point-blank brawl. Ships collided. Torpedoes crisscrossed the darkness. The battle was brutal and indecisive, but the Japanese bombardment was disrupted. Henderson Field survived. Barely. The Japanese regrouped. Admiral Nobutake Kondo, a cautious but competent commander, assembled a powerful force for a second attempt. This time, he would bring a battleship, Kirishima, a fast battlecruiser refitted and reclassified, mounting 8 14-inch guns. Escorting her were 4 cruisers and 9 destroyers. It was a sledgehammer force designed to smash through any American resistance, obliterate Henderson Field, and cover the troop transports waiting to land. Halsey responded by sending his own battleships. USS Washington and USS South Dakota, screened by 4 destroyers, raced north under the command of Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee Jr. Lee was 54 years old, a Naval Academy graduate, an Olympic gold medalist in shooting, and one of the Navy's foremost experts on radar and fire control. If anyone could make the new technology work under combat conditions, it was Lee. And that technology, radar, was about to change everything. That SG surface search radar installed on Washington was a revolution. Unlike older systems, it could detect surface ships at ranges beyond optical limits, even in total darkness or foul weather. It gave ranges, bearings, and approximate speeds. It allowed American gunners to aim and fire at targets they could not see. In theory, in practice, radar-directed gunnery was still it had never been proven in a major surface engagement. Many officers distrusted it, but Lee believed in it. He had studied it, tested it, and trained his crews relentlessly. Now he was about to stake his ships, his men, and the entire Guadalcanal campaign on it. November 14th turned into November 15th. Washington and South Dakota, with their 4 destroyer escorts walk Benham, Preston, and Gwinstein northwest through the darkness. The sea was calm. The night was moonless. Visibility was almost zero. Ahead lay Savo Island and the narrow waters of Ironbottom Sound, already a graveyard for dozens of ships. Lee knew the Japanese were coming. He didn't know exactly when or in what strength, but reconnaissance planes had spotted the enemy force heading south. Lee's orders were clear: stop them at all costs. At 2300 hours 11 p.m. Washington's radar picked up contacts. Multiple ships, closing fast. Lee maneuvered his small force into position, hugging the northern coast of Guadalcanal, using the island's landmass to mask his radar signature. It was a calculated gamble. If the Japanese spotted him first, he'd be trapped against the shore. But if he could get the jump on them, he'd have the advantage of surprise and superior gunnery range. The Japanese force entered Ironbottom Sound in a complex formation. Admiral Kondo's plan was methodical: send the destroyers ahead to sweep for American ships, follow with the cruisers in Kirishima, locate and destroy any opposition, then proceed to bombard Henderson Field. It was a sound plan. It had worked before. But Kondo didn't know about Washington's radar. He didn't know Lee was already tracking his every move. At 2316 hours, the American destroyers made contact. They spotted Japanese ships, visually dark shapes against the slightly lighter sky. Lee ordered them to engage. The 4 destroyers charged forward, launching torpedoes and opening fire with their 5-inch guns. It was a brave, desperate attack, and it bought time, but it also drew the full wrath of the Japanese screening force. The Japanese destroyers and cruisers tore into the American destroyers with overwhelming firepower. Searchlights blazed. Shells screamed. Within minutes, Walk was hit by a torpedo and blown apart. Preston took multiple heavy-caliber hits. Her bridge shattered, fires raging, and sank within minutes. Benham's bow was blown off by a torpedo. Only Gwyn escaped, limping away in the darkness. 3 destroyers crippled or sunk in less than 10 minutes. It was a massacre. But the sacrifice had achieved its purpose. The Japanese force was now disorganized, their attention focused on the destroyers, and behind them, unseen USS Washington was closing in. South Dakota, however, was in trouble. An electrical failure had knocked out her radar and fire control systems at the worst possible moment. Blind and vulnerable, she blundered into the middle of the Japanese formation. Searchlights locked onto her. Every Japanese gun in range opened fire. Shells hammered into South Dakota's superstructure. Her radar antennas were destroyed. Fires broke out. Men died. For several agonizing minutes, South Dakota absorbed a savage beating. She was saved only by her thick armor. Shells bounced off her belt and turrets, but she was effectively out of the fight. And that's when Washington struck. Admiral Lee had watched the chaos unfold on his radar screen. He saw the destroyers die. He saw South Dakota stumble into the enemy. He held his fire, waiting for the perfect moment. The Japanese were focused entirely on South Dakota. They had no idea Washington was there. Lee's radar operators fed him constant updates: range, bearing, speed. The fire control computers translated that data into firing solutions. Washington's 9 16-inch guns swung silently toward their target. At 2317 hours, Lee gave the order: fire. The night exploded. 9 massive shells, each weighing over a ton, roared out of Washington's guns at 2,500 feet per second. The muzzle flashes lit up the entire sound. The concussion shook the sea, and 7 miles away, in total darkness, those shells found their target. The battleship Kirishima. The first salvo struck Kirishima's superstructure. Her pagoda-mast, a towering multi-level command structure characteristic of Japanese battleships, was shredded. Radar antennas, rangefinders, fire control stations all obliterated. Her ability to coordinate her own guns was crippled in seconds. Washington fired again, and again, and again. For 9 minutes, she poured shells into Kirishima with machine-like precision. The Japanese battleship tried to return fire, but her optical rangefinders couldn't locate Washington in the darkness. Her shells splashed harmlessly into the sea. She was being torn apart by an enemy she couldn't see. Lee's radar operators tracked every shot. The fire control teams adjusted aim based on radar feedback. It was a textbook demonstration of radar-directed gunnery. Shells walked up Kirishima's length. Her forward turrets were hit. Her engineering spaces were penetrated. Fires raged out of control. Her speed dropped. She began to list out the Japanese cruisers, realizing what was happening. Tried to screen Kirishima with smoke and engage Washington, but Lee's secondary batteries drove them off. His 5-inch guns and 40mm mounts created a wall of steel that the cruisers couldn't penetrate, and all the while the 16-inch guns kept hammering Kirishima. By 2330 hours, Kirishima was finished. She was dead in the water, burning from stem to stern, listing heavily. Her crew was abandoning ship. Admiral Kondo, realizing the battle was lost, ordered a general withdrawal. The Japanese force turned north and fled into the night. Henderson Field was saved, but Washington wasn't done. Lee pursued the retreating Japanese force for several miles. his radar tracking them the entire way. Only when he was certain they were gone did he break off and return to check on South Dakota, and the surviving destroyer Kirishima burned through the night. Her crew tried to save her, but the damage was catastrophic. Fires spread to her magazines. Her hull was torn open in multiple places. At 0320 hours on November 15th, her captain ordered the ship scuttled. Torpedoes from escorting destroyers sent her to the bottom of Ironbottom Sound. She was the first battleship sunk by another battleship in the Pacific War, and she had been destroyed by an enemy she never saw. The Battle of Guadalcanal, called the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal or the Third Battle of Savo Island, was over. The Japanese had lost a battleship, a cruiser, 3 destroyers, and 11 troop transports. Thousands of soldiers who were supposed to reinforce Guadalcanal drowned or were killed when their transports were destroyed. The operation was a catastrophic failure. For the Americans, the cost had been heavy. 3 destroyers sunk, South Dakota badly damaged, hundreds of sailors dead, but Henderson Field survived. And more importantly, the Japanese never again attempted a major naval operation against Guadalcanal. The tide had turned. The strategic implications were profound. Guadalcanal would remain in American hands. Over the next 3 months, the Japanese would attempt smaller reinforcement runs, but they were increasingly costly and ineffective. By February 1943, Japan evacuated the island entirely. It was their first major land defeat of the war, and it signaled the beginning of the end for Japanese expansion in the Pacific. But the tactical implications were even more significant. The night of November 14th to 15th, 1942, had proven beyond any doubt that radar had changed naval warfare forever. The age of the big battleship slugging it out at visual range was over. From now on, the side with better sensors, better fire control, and better information would win regardless of how much armor or how many guns they had. Admiral Lee became a legend overnight. His calm, methodical use of radar and his trust in technology had won a battle that many thought unwinnable. He had taken the U.S. Navy's greatest weakness, night combatant, turned it into a strength. His tactics would be studied and emulated for the rest of the war. USS Washington returned to port a hero ship. Her crew was exhausted but jubilant. They had faced down a superior force in the worst possible conditions and won decisively. Washington would go on to serve throughout the Pacific War, participating in nearly every major operation until the end. She was never damaged by enemy action. Her crew called her the Mighty W. She had earned it. USS South Dakota, battered but unbowed, was repaired and returned to service. Her crew joked bitterly that they had saved Washington by drawing all the enemy fire. There was some truth to that. South Dakota's courage under fire absorbing a beating that would have sunk lesser ships had allowed Washington to maneuver freely. Both ships had played their part. For the Japanese Navy, the loss of Kirishima was both a tactical and psychological blow. She was a modern, fast battleship, exactly the kind of ship Japan needed to contest American naval power. Losing her to an enemy they couldn't even see was humiliating. Worse, it exposed a critical vulnerability. Japan's doctrine, tactics, and training were all based on optical gunnery and aggressive night attacks. Radar rendered much of that obsolete, and Japan, struggling with industrial capacity and resources, could not match the pace of American technological development. Japanese naval officers began to question their assumptions. If American ships could detect and destroy them in total darkness, how could they win? The answer, increasingly, was that they couldn't. Not in a straight fight. Japan's only hope was to delay, to try to make every American victory so costly that the U.S. would negotiate a peace. But that strategy, too, was doomed. America's industrial might was just beginning to wake up, and every month, the balance of power shifted further. The sailors who fought that night carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives. Men who had watched their friends die on the destroyers. Men who had stood on Washington's deck and felt the ship shudder as her guns fired. Men who had abandoned Kirishima as she sank, swimming through oil-slicked water in the darkness. War is often reduced to statistics, to maps with colored arrows, to discussions of strategy and tactics. But at its core, war is human. It's the 19-year-old loader feeding shells into a turret, hands blistered, ears ringing. It's the radar operator staring at a flickering green screen, translating blips into life and death. It's the captain standing on a bridge, making decisions that will save or doom hundreds of men. It's the sailor in the water, clinging to wreckage, hoping for rescue. On the night of November 14th to 15th, 1942, all of those men, American and Japanese, played their part in a moment that changed history. They didn't know it at the time. They were just trying to survive. But their actions that night demonstrated a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Adaptability wins wars. The side that learns faster, innovates better, and applies new technology more effectively will prevail. The United States had been humiliated at Savo Island. They had lost ships and men because they were unprepared for night combat. But instead of accepting defeat, they adapted. They developed radar. They trained their crews. They put officers like Willis Lee in command, men who understood that the future of naval warfare was in electronics and information, not just in guns and armor. And when the moment came, they executed flawlessly. Japan, by contrast, failed to adapt. They had won the early battles through superior tactics and training, but they assumed those advantages would last. They didn't invest in radar technology, they didn't change their doctrine, and when the technological balance shifted, they had no answer. The same tactics that had won at Savo Island led to disaster at Guadalcanal. This is the lesson of USS Washington versus Kirishima. It's not just a story about one ship sinking another. It's a story about how technology, properly applied, can overturn centuries of naval tradition. It's a story about the men who had the courage to trust in something new and unproven. And it's a story about the price of failure to adapt. Admiral Willis Lee did not live to see the end of the war. On August 25, 1945, just days after Japan's surrender, he died of a heart attack aboard his flagship. He was 57 years old. The Navy had lost one of its finest tactical minds, but his legacy lived on. The principles he demonstrated that night off Guadalcanal, trust in technology, disciplined fire control, aggressive but calculated tactics, became the foundation of U.S. Navy doctrine for decades. Washington was decommissioned in 1947 and scrapped in 1961. There were efforts to preserve her as a museum ship, but they failed. Today, nothing remains of the mighty W except photographs, documents, and memories. But her spirit endures in every modern warship that uses radar, every fire control system that tracks targets beyond visual range, every naval officer who understands that information dominance is the key to victory. Kirishima lies at the bottom of Ironbottom Sound, one of dozens of wrecks in those haunted waters. Divers have explored her remains. Her massive guns still point upward toward the surface, silent now, rusting slowly in the dark. She is a tomb for the men who died aboard her, and she is a monument to a way of war that ended the night Washington's radar found her in the darkness. The Battle of Guadalcanal was not the largest naval battle of World War II. It was not the most famous, but it was one of the most important. It proved that the United States could stand toe-to-toe with Japan's elite naval forces and win. It demonstrated that technology could overcome experience and tradition, and it marked the beginning of the end for Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. In 9 minutes. Willis Lee and USS Washington changed naval warfare forever. They showed the world that radar, this strange, new, barely understood technology, was not just a novelty. It was the future, and the Navy that mastered it would dominate the seas for generations to come. So when you think about the Pacific War, remember this: it wasn't just won by carriers and submarines and Marines storming beaches. It was also won by scientists and engineers developing radar, by officers like Lee who had the vision to embrace new technology, and by sailors who trusted their equipment, followed their training, and executed their mission with precision and courage. The night of November 14th to 15th, 1942 was dark and terrifying. Men died, ships burned, the ocean ran red with blood. But when dawn broke over Guadalcanal, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted. Japan's advance was stopped, America's counteroffensive had begun, and radar had proven itself the weapon that would help win the war. This is the story of USS Washington versus Kirishima, the first radar-directed night battle in naval history. The moment technology defeated tradition, the 9 minutes that changed everything. And it's a reminder that, in war, as in life, the future belongs to those who adapt.